Hello, I'm Waqar Rizvi, and this is Scope. We're going to start off today's show by discussing hate crimes in Canada. There is just recently what's happened not too long ago in London, Ontario, with the killing of the Muslim family there. One of the hate crimes that's probably most public and evident that we can talk about. But even on top of that, within the context of the pandemic, we have seen a number of hate crimes being carried out against people of East Asian descent, Southeast Asian descent, in places like Vancouver and otherwise. So the numbers as well, just over a week ago or so, Statistics Canada revealed a report in which it said overall hate crime has increased by 37% over the past year. But then it also then breaks that down, and the breakdown is quite disturbing because there's an increase of 301% towards people of East or Southeast Asian descent and people of those communities. So that's extremely disturbing, and certainly there is also a significant increase against the Indigenous peoples of Canada as well as Black communities in Canada as well. We're going to discuss that now, as well as all the connected issues, both Islamophobia and even just regular racism towards other people of other ethnicities, faiths, groups in Canada at this time. We're joined now by Irfan Chaudhry, who is a researcher, and he works with the Office of Human Rights, Diversity and Equity at McEwan University. He's joining us this morning from Edmonton, Alberta. Joining us from Ottawa, Ontario is John Packer, who's a professor of law, and he is the director of the Human Rights Research and Education Centre at the University of Ottawa. And joining us from Toronto, Ontario is Richard Moon, who is a distinguished university professor and professor of law at the University of Windsor. Richard, John, and Irfan, good morning to all three of you, and thank you to you all for joining us. Richard, I'd like to start with you, if I may. What do you make of the statistics? Overall, 37% in and of itself is disturbing, but then when you break it down, it really does show quite a drastic increase in hate towards a very specific community, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we've seen a rise in acts of hatred and hate speech more generally towards the Muslim community and towards the Chinese community in particular. I think there are a variety of reasons for that, but I assume we'll explore some of those.
Yeah, and John, what do you think that the federal government, or let me put it this way, in fact, how do you think that the federal government has reacted, and do you think that the reaction has been satisfactory?
Well, I think it's been overdue. Just very recently, and I should preface this by saying that there is an anticipated election in Canada, so there's suddenly a lot more attention from the sitting government, amongst others. But on 21 and 22 July, so just a couple weeks ago, the government, on very kind of short notice, hosted two summits, as they called them, back-to-back, one on anti-Semitism, because anti-Semitic rhetoric and racism has also been rising, followed by an Islamophobia summit. But both were really on the basis of a couple weeks' notice, so a kind of effort to catch up in dealing with this problem, which has antecedents. It's not like it's suddenly occurred. It's been rising. And the federal government has been a little lame in its response. Prime Minister, for political reasons, where he gets a lot of votes in Quebec, doesn't want to really challenge that. In addition, the federal government hasn't robustly supported, for example, the institutions. The Canadian Human Rights Commission has never been restored its full funding that was taken away under the previous government of Harper. So there's a lot of things that need to be done here on multi-sectors of society, both the governmental side, the educational programs, and people to people. This is a social issue. And if I could add one last thing,
sure.
A benefit Canada does have is we do have established in the law that there is no right to kind of unlimited speech. Hate speech is actually prohibited in Canada, unlike south of the border. And really, this needs to be addressed in a determined fashion.
And, you know, Irfan, I don't want to put you on the spot, but I know in Edmonton there have been a couple of cases of Muslim women being attacked and or harassed in some fashion. So I wonder what the mood is like in that city, and what your thoughts are then overall about how both the provincial as well as federal governments have reacted then to that sort of hate, as well as just overall racism in the country.
Yeah, I mean, it's been obviously very heavy for sure here in the city. You know, the last one was fairly violent, where two young women who were wearing the hijab were attacked by an unidentified man in broad daylight. I don't think they were able to still kind of find out who was behind that. They're still looking. But our provincial government has put forward some really, in my opinion, bizarre, recommendations to the federal government. Just as of, a couple of days ago, our provincial Minister of Justice received a letter back from the federal government rejecting his request to legalize the carrying of pepper spray, because that was one of his suggestions on addressing hate crimes in Alberta, and not necessarily getting at the root cause of, the hatred that, we're talking about. And even alluding to, the comment by the previous guest with the summits that were held last week, my understanding is they were very still politically heavy. And so, the tangible actions that are impacting communities of color of various backgrounds, I think there needs to be more appetite for action versus what I think we're seeing is a lot of discussions. And, again, alluding to the fact that we might have a federal election coming up here pretty soon as well. So it's all interconnected. And I hate to see this become politicized, but I think, given the timing, it likely is going to be a political issue, and how it gets addressed, I think, will be the meaningful, movement we're hoping to see.
And so, Richard, that leads me well into my next question. Do you think that we can move beyond the politics of this as in not just have safe face moves and safe face rhetoric, but actually then have action on the ground? Because, for myself, I grew up in Toronto, so I know it's a very diverse city, it's a multicultural city, and it's sort of, many of the times when these things happen in a place like Canada, which is as multicultural it is, for many of the people outside Canada, it sort of just completely doesn't make sense. How is it that so many people living side by side of different cultures, faiths, and ethnicities can still have these sorts of issues in a country like Canada?
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize we don't need to be talking about a lot of people to do these dangerous and harmful acts or to spread hateful views. The reality is that the internet has facilitated the spread of hateful views, the encouragement of harmful actions. Initially, this occurred through more or less obscure websites at the margins of public conversation online. But of course, it's moved much more into social media, and in that sense some hateful views spread more easily and more widely on social media platforms. So that's the real problem. And the federal government has certainly talked quite a bit about trying to respond to this through legislation. And to this point, really, in addressing the spread of hate online on social media platforms, they are at the point really only of generating discussion and discussion papers. I'm not unsympathetic to the challenge of trying to create a system that takes down hateful communication online without overreaching and having the consequence of restricting what might be legitimate speech. In any event, there is some legislation on the table addressing certain aspects of this, but it will almost certainly die when an election is called fairly shortly, as is anticipated.
If we can, let's look at the root causes of this, or what you may feel are the root causes of why we're seeing what we're seeing happening right now, or over the past year at least. There would be many people, John, who would point to the other side of the border and say, hey, listen, this is all an effect of Trumpism, where many people have felt emboldened to then, speak out in whatever hateful fashion that they may have been, feelings that they may have been harboring for many years, but now they're able to feel confident enough to say it out loud in some ways. Is it down to Trumpism? Is that an easy scapegoat?
Oh, Trumpism is part of it, but I would just say it's a kind of sharp end of the spear. There's a background, as I mentioned, antecedents. We've had now, not just in south of the border and not just in Canada, but much of the world, a kind of a move to what I would call mean politics. And the idea of othering and scapegoating and so forth. This has become a kind of instrument of politics in many parts of the world, also in Canada. So certainly we had the same kind of voicing, including by politicians, of things that not too many years ago we would have all considered inappropriate, and now they seem to be acceptable. the last speaker is correct that the internet has simply exacerbated this. But I think there are some other things. First of all, we've had a demographic change in Canada, a significant change of the character of immigration. We have growing populations of persons of color, persons of different faiths. The Muslim population has increased in Canada a relative percentage. So is our Indigenous population, which is growing. And this coincides with a lot of discomfort over uncertainty in the economy, a lot of alienation of stagnation in jobs and incomes. COVID hasn't helped it. So there are many things which have coincided here. And I think that when people feel insecure and fearful, they look at ways in which they can blame others. And unfortunately, our society is not, and particularly politicians, have not responded in a very clear way in this. And that's why you say the summits are coming very late. There are systemic elements. I just like to emphasize the systemic elements which are only now being recognized. And just to give a specific example, tax policy for example, in Canada, which it now turns out that the overwhelming number of targeted entities for removal of charitable status were Muslim. That doesn't make sense in a country where the Muslim population is only about, is very small. So this is the kind of thing that has to be looked at.
Irfan, all of this, at least of these recent years, has happened under a Liberal government. Justin Trudeau has, been able to speak very, very well when it comes to reactions to any hate crimes, in fact. And his predecessor, Stephen Harper, was much criticized for his rhetoric towards a whole host of minorities, not just Muslims. Why is this still happening under a Liberal government with a prime minister who has been as seemingly forthcoming and accepting of minorities at this time and during his tenure?
Yeah, I think, just alluding to some of the points earlier, we've seen some really interesting, shifts politically. We've seen some shifts in terms of, more presence on, various social media platforms that are normalizing, anti, whichever group hatred right now. But I think, at the same time, still acknowledging that a lot more work needs to be done. This is the same government that at least had reinstated, anti-racism funding as an example that was cut under the previous Conservative government. And so not saying that, funding is going to solve, everything, but I think when you have the sustainable funding to address anti-racism, to provide education, to provide, financial resources for communities to be able to, address this issue head on, you are able to make some traction, because that's what's been missing, since the last 5 years at least, when this funding was not around and was not made as a priority. And so I think it needs to be built on some of these things. I think there's still some elements that need to be, dialogued further. And I think one thing I'd be advocating for, regardless of who's in, their position of power, whether Liberal or conservative, funding to address hate needs to be sustainable, not just project-based as it has been in the past. The Liberal government introduced like a 3-year program around anti-racism funding, which is okay, but I think there needs to be more sustainability for some of these. It's similar to how we deal with infrastructure projects, similar to how we deal with housing projects. I think we also need to have sustainable funding with how we address hate, because for far too long we've treated this as a funding as a nice to have versus a must have. Are we being inclusive in terms of people's backgrounds? If someone needs an accommodation due to a protected ground based on human rights legislation, are we able to do that? Or again, that's where some of these challenges of inclusion come up. One example often that comes forward is for Muslim students who may be asked to also write an exam on a Friday afternoon that might coincide or conflict with, Friday afternoon prayer. And that's, as an institution, we have a duty to accommodate religious obligation. And so rather than trying to put the onus on, in this example, the students to try to advocate for themselves to, take that time off.
I'm going back to the fact that Toronto and Canada is a very diverse country and very multicultural, because we've been told over and over again that, listen, people-to-people contact is extremely important to break down barriers amongst people of different faiths, ethnicities, background, et cetera, right? Is that not then the case? Because, is Canada almost proving that, or am I overstating it?
No, I think it does. And I think Canada, in fact, does provide evidence that is the case. But it's never going to be completely so. It's never going to be entirely effective. And of course, in Canada, populations are distributed in different ways. If you go into rural parts of Canada, they're still predominantly European ancestry. It's in the big cities where you have the most significant diversity in community. And even then, within the large cities, groups tend to live in common neighborhoods. So, how much interaction goes on in people's daily lives, how much people get to know each other from different groups, there are always going to be limits to that. But I certainly would not want it to be even thought for a minute that, that Canada is very much a success story. I think it is very much the case that Canada's a success story, demonstrating that different groups can, in fact, live together, come to understand each other better, even though obviously we have these failings that we have to continue to address.
And John, I'm going to give you the word before I let all three of you go. There is, critics would say, the huge argument and the huge concern that, listen, if you're going to try to legislate things, that may very well encroach on free speech. And certainly in Canada, that's a very important value. How does one and can one balance that sort of thing?
Well, as I already mentioned, it's well established, and not only in Canada, in international law, and across Europe and many other places, that one does not have an unlimited right of speech, and certainly not a right to harm others, even on a very basic moral level. So that's well established in Canadian law and Canadian jurisprudence. And there aren't too many people who are asserting that. I think it's more in the kind of complexity of relations, the diversity, the mixing, the last speaker was just mentioning. Let me just say, however, that we do, the statistics of rising hate crimes and hate speech do indicate we have to be ever vigilant. And in this, we have to recognize there is a bit of a risk here of identity politics if we are not assertively trying to address those who would breach the law and these standards. But in addition, we have to be very careful not to reify things like race, which is itself a construct. So there's racism, and there are certainly racists, but we have to be very careful in the way in which we build our institutions and our systems of fairness, that we don't end up promoting something that we don't really wish to do. The last speaker is correct. On the whole, multiculturalism as a policy has been very successful in Canada. There is a lot of mixing, a lot of intermarriage, but certainly we continue, like the rest of the world, to have these problems.
Very well, but we really appreciate John, Richard, and Irfan for taking their time out of their busy schedules this morning to speak to us from Edmonton, Ottawa, and Toronto, respectively. We were discussing their Statistics Canada, report that came out about a week or so ago about hate crimes and the breakdown of those hate crimes. Most disturbing increase, certainly towards the East and Southeast Asian community in the context of the pandemic and the misinformation that had been put out there regarding that community and its role in the pandemic overall. This has not just happened in Canada, it's happened in many places, including the U.S. and others. Nevertheless, there's also been that very disturbing Islamophobic terror attack in London not too long ago, on London, Ontario, that is. And certainly there is a lot to be said about how the federal government has reacted to this. Yes, we've had summits on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, which should be applauded as initiatives, because those are important. But is this just about politics at this point in time, more so than actual real-world, on-the-ground changes? Now, we've discussed a number of those. Is it the law? Is it education? What needs to actually be happening on the part of people, companies as well, to ensure a more tolerant Canada, as Canada has always prided itself as being? I'll be back with our next segment after this break. Welcome back, viewers. You're still here in the Scope with me, Waqar Rizvi. Now, we've discussed this topic a number of times as it's gone through the process of being repealed, but the AUMF, or the Authorization for the Use of Military Force, which goes back to 1991 as well as 2002, I believe it is, which are basically bills that were in the U.S. and they're still very much standing, that give the president power, the U.S. president, that is, power to take the country to war, or at least carry out strikes or attacks if he or she feels that it is completely imminent or emergency or necessary. Now, a lot of people have argued that the AUMF was, of course, used in 2002, more specifically to go into Iraq and to carry out the Iraq War. Now, a lot of people, and this has been argued for quite a while now. So as I said, we've done this show a number of times in the past throughout this process, but now we've had the Senate Foreign Relations Committee advancing legislation at this point in time that would repeal then this pair of war authorizations. essentially giving back the power then to Congress to ensure and to oversee any decisions that a president would make. There have been amendments also proposed that would still certainly keep loopholes, and I think those loopholes are probably even within the repeals that are currently being discussed to give a president certainly emergency powers if he or she feels the need to use them. Let's discuss these issues a bit further. We're now joined by Dr. Gordon Adams, who is a distinguished fellow at the Quincy Institute. He's also professor emeritus at the School of International Service at American University. He is joining us from Brunswick, Maine, and joining us from New York is Adam Weinstein, who's a former U.S. Marine who served in Afghanistan. He's also a research fellow at the Quincy Institute. Adam and Gordon, good morning to you both, and thank you both for joining us this morning. Adam, I'd like to start with you. There's a lot of talk when it comes to the AUMF about the fact that Donald Trump misused it when it came to the Soleimani assassination, and then that was the perfect example of why this needs to be repealed. Do you agree with that?
Well, I do agree that the Soleimani strike was an example of abuse of the AUMFs, although I'd argue that 3 consecutive presidential administrations have misused the AUMFs, which have been interpreted more broadly each year. And that's why it's important for Congress not to abdicate its oversight responsibility and for there not to be open-ended AUMFs that last 2 decades on the books.
The very obvious, argument on the other side is that, listen, the president must have the power to do these things if he or she feels the immediate need to do so. How would you respond to that?
Well, I think that Congress over the past probably 60 or 70 years has essentially abdicated its responsibilities under the Constitution of the United States that provides that Congress shall have the right to declare war and not the president. This has been a constant tug of war for that whole period of time. And if the 2002 and 1991 authorizations, both of which related to Iraq specifically, are repealed, it would be the first such repeal of a congressional authorization since the Tonkin Resolution back in 1964 that justified and authorized the war in Vietnam. So it would be an enormously important first step. It's also important to know, though, it would only be a first step. That is to say, those 2 authorities, 1991 and 2002, apply to Iraq. They do not apply to the U.S. global military action against terrorist organizations. Those are authorized under a 2001 authorization for the use of military force. And while the House of Representatives, the lower house of Congress, has argued vigorously and passed efforts as much as June of this year to repeal the 2001 authorization of the global war on terror, the Senate action did not do that. And there is considerable disagreement in the Congress about whether the 2001 authorization for the use of military force for the war on terror ought to be repealed. That has been stretched even further than the 2002 authorization for Iraq.
Adam, there would also be an argument that the AUMF, at least the 2002 one, was a mistake to begin with. Do you agree with that?
Well, insofar as that the war in Iraq was a mistake, I agree with that. But I also feel that the global war on terror has been a mistake in the way that it's been executed and has become the textbook definition of mission creep. So I agree with the other guests that this is just a first step. And in some ways, it's a first step regarding a war that there's large bipartisan consensus that it was a mistake. In the case of the war on terror, it will be a heavier lift because I think there's still a decent amount of lawmakers who do believe that we should be engaged in perpetual conflict across the globe in pursuit of terrorism. But among the broader U.S. population, there's a rejection of that idea, and hopefully Congress catches up.
I was actually going to ask you about that, Gordon. Where do you think the American people stand when it comes to the sort of, if I may use the term, militarism?
Well, what's interesting about where the American people stand is that the activities under the 2001 authorization are estimated by the Congressional Research Service to apply to now action by the U.S. military in 19 countries around the world, including the Middle East, including Africa, including even a couple of countries in Asia. What's interesting about that 2001 authorization is that the actual list of countries to which it applies is secret, and the decision to authorize military force under that authorization is retained by the president and the White House alone, which means Congress really neither has full information nor has the authority to step in terms of those kinds of conflicts. What that means, because it's secret, is because by and large, the American people don't really know. They know about Afghanistan. Maybe a few know about a number of countries in Africa. I suspect not many Americans at all know that there are still 700 American forces in northeastern Syria who are engaged in mop-up operations against ISIS and security operations there. Nobody has any sense at all that the United States is involved with support for counterterror operations in the Philippines and so on. So the American public, I think Adam is right, is generally soft to the idea of repeal, but they don't really know very much about that. So it may be possible to do the first step here, the 2002 authorization. I think it's a heavier lift, and there is disagreement within the Republican Party about 2001. There's disagreement between the Congress and the White House about 2001. They are all much more reluctant to move on that authority, although there is considerable bipartisan support in the Congress to try to do so.
Adam, around the Soleimani assassination especially, there was a lot of talk about, hey, we need to control the president's powers, and I'm not just talking about Donald Trump, to go to war with Iran, for example, to enter into another Middle East war, so to speak. Would the repeal of these two AUMFs stop that? Is that, do you think, partly the goal here?
I think the repeal would be a first step in starting that process. But even if we repealed the 2001 AUMF, I think we'd still have to fundamentally alter the culture of Washington, D.C. And I do worry about repealing the AUMFs while troops are still forward deployed in these parts of the world, and creating perhaps a new narrowly tailored AUMF that nevertheless grandfathers in the basic logic of these forever wars. And speaking to Dr. Adams' point about the American people being out of the loop, I think that is true. And I think the foreign policy establishment in D.C. has taken advantage of that. And we also see that Americans broadly reject the idea of endless war, but it might not be their top priority given the litany of domestic issues that Americans face. And so I think the foreign policy establishment in Washington, D.C. has taken advantage of where ending endless wars falls in the priority list of Americans, and to some extent the ignorance of Americans to the way these wars have been carried out. And there is a group of people in D.C. who truly believe that the waging of war abroad should be detached from the democratic process. I mean, you saw people bemoaning the fact that Afghanistan was being discussed in the context of the U.S. presidential election, as if whether we withdraw or stay in Afghanistan should be completely siphoned off from a presidential election. And I completely reject that. It's not the way that foreign policy is supposed to be crafted. The American people are still supposed to have a say for when we send young Americans into harm's way.
Thinking about how foreign policy should be constructed, Gordon, going forward, then is some people have pointed out, and I'm using the example of Iran because it's one of the more obvious ones in the context of the AUMF and what may very well have happened around the Soleimani assassination. At least that's what the fears were, right, of a war. That the new president of Iran, Raisi, didn't actually come out very strongly in his first statement and just bash the U.S. Right? He in fact almost, in some people's words, put out an olive branch where he said, listen, we do want to continue the talks in Vienna in some ways. And I know I'm paraphrasing certainly his words a lot. But do you think that this will give pause maybe to how foreign policy is conducted, for example, towards Iran, that it would be less than aggressive and then less, dependent possibly on pressing that red button?
There's no question in my mind that those in the Republican Party, Senator McConnell has actually said this on the floor of the Senate, those who want relatively open space for military action against Iran oppose the repeal of the AUMF, particularly the 2001 AUMF. Using it to justify a military conflict with Iran would stretch it practically to the breaking point, because it clearly bears no relationship to the attacks that Al-Qaeda and ISIS were carrying out in other regions in the Middle East. It would stretch it indeed. The hesitation, I think, of the executive branch to the repeal of 2001, or any effort to rewrite it and narrow its scope, I think is also a hedge around what might have to happen with respect to Iran. So I have no question in my mind that the supporters of the 2001 repeal very much like Senator Chris Murphy of Connecticut, see it very much in the context of saying, let's have more open debate. Let's not have an open door here to any kind of military action. Let's make sure that if military action is being contemplated in Iran, that the Congress is deeply involved, that there are hearings that are held, that there has to be a vote, that there has to be a congressional peace here, without using these rather flimsy justifications for military action.
Let me give you the final word. I'm going to ask you quite an open-ended question. Does and will the repeal then of these two AUMFs in many ways, A, give pause to any U.S. president to go to war, and B, almost block that sort of tendency? I use the word tendency loosely as well. I'm not saying every U.S. president would want to go to war, but that would be a lot more further down the list of options.
Well, I think it will certainly give pause to it. And I think the Biden administration probably would like to have these AUMFs repealed, because I think it's been an incredible stress on the shoulders of presidents to have the option to use of force. And I think in some sense, presidents would like to have their hands tied a little bit more. And that might seem counterintuitive, but having the option and not using it can have a domestic political cost. And so I think making a little bit harder to use force abroad would be a welcome step by presidents, and particularly President Biden in this case. Whether it changes the ease with which we go to war in the future, I think will depend on whether Congress has learned the lessons of the last 20 years and gives itself pause before issuing future authorizations for use of military force.
We're going to leave it there at that, but we really appreciate both Adam and Gordon for their time this morning and for sharing their expertise with us and contextualizing this discussion about the AUMFs, which is the authorization for the use of military force. And there are two legislations that Congress and Senate are looking to repeal, and that is go back to 1991 and 2002. And as Gordon there correctly pointed out, there are a number of other legislations which are more broad and talk about the war on terror, and those right now at least are not on the table, seemingly at this point in time. But this would then limit things such as an option to go to war with Iran, not take it off the table, certainly, if the U.S. were to feel that would necessary for its homeland security, but at least it would not be as high up on the list of options as originally thought. And this goes back to the Soleimani assassination, which was greatly criticized even within the U.S. That's not to say anyone was a fan of Soleimani in the U.S., but at the same time, there were many concerns about the misuse on the part of a U.S. president such as Donald Trump of his power to then be able to strike, quote unquote, an enemy or adversary on foreign soil, no less, but and the possibility that would then lead to war, which was something certainly a very real possibility at that point in time. I'll leave it there for now. I've been Waqar Rizvi. Thanks for watching.